August 23rd, 1942. 15 kilometers northwest of Stalingrad, Russia. Through the dust and smoke of the approaching German armored column, 19-year-old Klavdia Loganova couldn't hide her trembling hands as she gripped the elevation wheel of her 37mm anti-aircraft gun. The high school graduate had volunteered for the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment 3 weeks earlier, trained to shoot at aircraft, not tanks. But the 16th Panzer Division rolling toward her position didn't care what she'd been trained for. "They're too close," whispered Maria, the loader beside her, still wearing the Sunday dress she'd put on that morning before the bombing started. "We're supposed to shoot at planes." Klavdia watched the lead Panzer IV, its cross clearly visible now at 800 meters. The gun crew had never fired at a ground target. They'd never been shown how. Nobody had told them they'd be fighting tanks. "Lower the gun," Klavdia said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Aim through the barrel. Fire when you see their faces." What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary stands in military history. For 2 days, teenage girls in Sunday clothes, factory workers in coveralls, and university students with no combat training would hold the line against the most experienced Panzer Division in the Wehrmacht. They weren't soldiers. They had no military training for ground combat. Most had never fired a weapon in anger before that morning. But they would destroy 83 tanks before their guns fell silent. This is the story of the women who picked up rifles from fallen defenders, who learned to kill while watching their friends die, who became snipers without ever attending sniper school. These weren't the trained markswomen of Soviet propaganda, the graduates of the Central Women's School of Sniper Training. These were civilians, mothers, daughters, factory workers, and students who found themselves trapped in hell with only one choice: fight or die. The official Soviet narrative wanted heroic women warriors. What Stalingrad got instead were desperate civilians who discovered they could kill to survive. The city that would become the bloodiest battlefield in human history wasn't prepared for what was coming. On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued Order Number 227, the infamous "not a step back" decree. What wasn't publicized was that this order effectively extended to Stalingrad's civilian population. Factory workers were reclassified as mobilized soldiers. Leaving your workplace without permission became desertion, punishable by military tribunal.
We were making T-34 parts on Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the factory managers told us we were now military personnel. We couldn't leave. Our families couldn't leave with us unless they also worked in essential production. My mother was stuck on the other side of the city. I never saw her again. The bombing came on August 23, 1942. General Oberst Wolfram von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4, the most powerful air command in the world, dropped 1,000 tons of bombs in a single day. The predominantly wooden city, overcrowded with refugees and lacking adequate bomb shelters, became an inferno. Survivor Valentina Krutova, 16 years old when the bombing began, described it decades later. The Volga itself caught fire. The oil storage tanks exploded and burning oil poured into the river until the water was flames. I watched people jump into the river to escape the burning buildings and cook alive in boiling water. The screaming didn't stop for hours. As many as 70,000 civilians died in that first week of bombing. Another 500,000 remained trapped as the city became a battlefield. The official evacuation had been delayed until it was too late. Stalin allegedly declared that soldiers don't fight for empty cities, deliberately keeping civilians in place to motivate defenders. Whether he actually said this remains disputed, but the result was undeniable. 500,000 people, mostly women and children, were trapped in a city being systematically destroyed. The burden of initial defense fell on the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment. The unit consisted primarily of teenage girls who'd volunteered months earlier, most barely out of high school. They'd been trained to operate 37mm anti-aircraft guns against the Luftwaffe. They'd practiced tracking aircraft, calculating lead angles, firing at targets moving overhead. Nobody had trained them to fight tanks. On August 23rd, as the German bombers turned the city into rubble, the 16th Panzer Division advanced from the northwest toward Gumrach Airport. Between them and their objective stood 37 anti-aircraft positions manned by the 1077th Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Joachim Kahler, commanding a panzer company in the 16th Division, later described the encounter in his combat report. We expected to overrun the anti-aircraft positions quickly. They were designed for air defense, not anti-tank work. When we came within range, the guns depressed to minimum elevation and opened fire directly at our tanks. The fire was inaccurate at first, they were clearly untrained for this role, but they adjusted quickly. The girls of the 1077th did something their commanders hadn't ordered and their training hadn't covered. They lowered their guns to the horizontal, aimed through the gun barrels because they lacked ground target sights, and opened fire on the panzers. The 37mm gun, designed to punch through aircraft aluminum, struggled against tank armor. Direct hits to the front glacis plate bounced off. But the girls learned fast. They aimed for tracks, vision slits, engine compartments, and turret rings. They learned that a damaged track meant a stationary target. They learned that hitting the engine deck could cause fires. They learned while German machine gunners raked their positions, while 75mm tank guns exploded around them, while their friends died beside them. Captain Sarkisian, commanding nearby mortar batteries, watched the anti-aircraft positions from 600 meters away. His account, preserved in Soviet military archives, captures the desperation and determination. Every time an anti-aircraft gun fell silent, I'd exclaim, "Oh, they're finished! They've been wiped out!" But each time, after a pause, the guns started to fire again. I could see them through binoculars. Girls in civilian clothes, some in dresses, loading and firing as fast as they could. When one girl fell, another took her place. When the gun crew was wiped out, girls from neighboring positions would run across open ground under fire to man the abandoned gun. The German 16th Panzer Division had fought across France, Poland, and deep into Russia. They were veterans of 3 years of continuous combat. They expected to sweep aside the anti-aircraft positions in an hour. It took 2 days of brutal combat to silence all 37 gun positions. German after-action reports noted the ferocity of the resistance. Multiple Panzer commanders mentioned their surprise at discovering the gun crews were women. Obergefreiter Kurt Reuber, a German medical officer who later died in the Stalingrad pocket, wrote in his diary,
"Today we overran the anti-aircraft positions that had been holding up our advance. I was ordered forward to treat wounded. The Russian gun crews were girls, teenagers. Some couldn't have been older than 17 or 18. Many were still in civilian clothes. They had fought to the last shell, then to the last woman. I found one girl at her gun, both legs blown off, still trying to load another round. She died while we were trying to move her. She never said a word, just looked at me with such hatred that I'll remember it until I die. According to official Soviet records, the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment destroyed or damaged 83 tanks, 15 armored personnel carriers, dispersed 3 battalions of infantry, and shot down 14 aircraft during those 2 days. German records confirm tank losses in that sector exceeded 70 vehicles, with surprisingly effective fire from anti-aircraft positions cited as a primary cause. When German troops finally overran the last gun position on August 25th, they found something that disturbed even hardened SS troops. Dead girls at their guns, wearing summer dresses, many without helmets or proper military equipment. Some clutched photographs of families, others had school notebooks in their pockets. The 1077th had bought the city 2 days. 2 days for Soviet reinforcements to cross the Volga. 2 days for defensive positions to be prepared. 2 days that would prove critical when the battle for Stalingrad began in earnest. But the teenage girls of the 1077th were only the beginning. As September turned the city into a charnel house of street fighting, a different kind of warfare emerged, one that would transform housewives, students, and factory workers into some of the deadliest combatants in the battle. By September 1942, Stalingrad had become what German soldiers called Rattenkrieg, rat war. Buildings were cleared room by room. Soldiers fought on alternate floors of the same building, firing at each other through holes in the ceilings. The sewers became battlefields. Every pile of rubble could hide death. In this nightmare landscape, civilians who'd remained in the city found themselves facing an impossible choice. The NKVD organized hastily formed workers' militias. Civilian factory workers and students pressed into immediate combat service. Many were sent to the front lines without rifles. Yekaterina Konstantinova, 21 years old, a stenographer at the Barakadi Arms Factory, described her induction into combat. September 14th. The Germans broke through to the factory district. They announced that everyone able to hold a rifle was now in the militia. They didn't ask, they told us. I said I'd never fired a gun. The political officer handed me a Mosin Nagant rifle and 10 cartridges. He said, "You'll learn." Then he pointed at the factory floor and said the Germans were 200 meters away. I asked where my unit was. He said, "There is no unit. There's a pile of rubble and Germans on the other side. Shoot any German you see. If you run, the NKVD will shoot you." This was the reality for thousands of Stalingrad's remaining civilians. Not trained warriors volunteering for glory, not professional soldiers accepting dangerous assignments, just ordinary people, primarily women since most able-bodied men were already in uniform, handed weapons and told to fight or be executed as deserters. The transformation from civilian to killer happened in moments of pure terror. Marina Chechneva, a 19-year-old university student studying literature, had remained in Stalingrad caring for her sick grandmother. Her account, recorded in 1973 for local historians, but never published during Soviet times, reveals the psychological trauma.
September 22nd. I was in the basement of our apartment building with 7 other women and children. A Soviet soldier fell down the stairs, shot through the chest. He died in maybe 30 seconds. His rifle clattered on the concrete. I could hear German voices above in what used to be our apartment. Nobody moved. We just stared at the rifle. Then, the grandmother next to me, Olga Pavlovna, maybe 65 years old, picked up the rifle. She worked the bolt like she'd done it 1,000 times. I asked her how she knew how. She said her husband had taught her to shoot wolves before the revolution. She went to the stairs. She couldn't climb them because of her legs, so she just sat at the bottom step and waited. When a German came down to investigate, she shot him. Then another one. Then a third one. She killed 3 men in maybe 15 seconds. Then she came back down, sat against the wall, and cried for an hour. After that, we all learned to shoot. Not because we wanted to, because the alternative was dying in that basement. The weapon that transformed these civilians into effective combatants was the Mosin Nagant rifle. Designed in 1891, this bolt-action rifle had armed the Tsar's army through World War I, the Civil War, and now found itself in the hands of desperate women who'd never imagined they'd kill another human being. The rifle was simple, crude, and brutally effective. A 5-round Intrudal magazine, 7.62mm cartridge, effective range of 500 meters in trained hands, less in the hands of terrified civilians firing for the first time. But in the rubble of Stalingrad, where most combat happened at distances under 100 meters, even untrained women could kill with it. What made these improvised civilian fighters surprisingly effective was the nature of urban combat itself. Traditional military advantages, artillery, tanks, aircraft, meant little in street fighting. A sniper hidden in rubble was worth more than a panzer. Patience mattered more than tactics. Stillness counted more than speed. Women discovered they possessed natural advantages in this environment. Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Chukov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, noted in his memoirs, "Women snipers proved remarkably effective in the ruins. They had the patience to wait hours for a single shot. They could remain motionless in cramped positions that would drive men mad. And they were motivated by something deeper than military discipline. They were defending their homes from invaders who'd destroyed their city and killed their families. That kind of hatred makes for very effective soldiers." Nadezhda Kolesnikova wasn't a soldier, never wanted to be a soldier, and according to official records, never was a soldier. She was a 26-year-old mother of 2 who worked as a seamstress in Stalingrad. When the Germans reached her neighborhood in late September 1942, her children had been evacuated weeks earlier, but she'd remained behind to work in a uniform repair depot. Her story emerges from fragments, a mention in another woman's memoir, a notation in NKVD records, an interview conducted in 1968 that wasn't published for another 40 years. She appears in no official lists of Soviet snipers. She received no medals, attended no sniper school, never formally enlisted in the Red Army. But over the course of 73 days in Stalingrad, Nadezhda Kolesnikova killed 17 German soldiers. Her method was simple and born of pure necessity. Her building, what remained of it, overlooked a German-occupied street. Soviet forces held the building across the street. The Germans used the street to move supplies and troops between positions. Nadezhda, trapped in the ruins with a dozen other civilians and 3 wounded Soviet soldiers, picked up a Mosin Nagant from a dead defender. "I didn't know how to aim properly," she admitted decades later. "The soldiers showed me, you line up the front sight with the rear sight, put it on the target, and squeeze the trigger gently. I practiced on rubble for 2 days before I shot at a person. When I finally did it, I vomited for an hour afterward. The 3rd time was easier. By the 10th time, I felt nothing." The German occupiers never located her position. She'd fire 1 shot, maybe 2 if the opportunity presented itself, then disappear into the rubble. She didn't engage in duels with German snipers. She didn't take heroic risks. She just shot soldiers when they exposed themselves, then hid. This pattern repeated across the ruins. Women who'd never imagined killing anyone found themselves doing exactly that. Not because they'd been trained, not because they'd volunteered for combat duty, but because in Stalingrad there was no rear area, no safety, no place where you weren't in the battle. The Stalingrad tractor factory became another flashpoint where civilian women transformed into fighters. The factory had continued producing tanks even as the battle raged around it. T-34s rolled off the assembly line, unpainted, without gun sights, driven directly from the factory floor to the front line by volunteer crews who had hours of training, if that. When the Germans reached the factory in October 1942, the workers became defenders. Anastasia Fedorovna, a 31-year-old lathe operator, described the transformation. October 15th. The Germans breached the Western Wall. The factory director announced that everyone was now in the Workers' Defense Battalion. They handed out rifles, maybe one for every 3 people. Most of us had no idea how to use them. I found myself in the lathe workshop with 8 other women and 2 old men. We had 3 rifles between us. Outside, we could hear the Germans clearing the adjacent buildings. Someone said we should surrender. Then one of the women, Katya, started crying. She said the Germans had killed her sister in Kharkiv. She picked up a rifle and went to the window. She killed 2 Germans before they spotted her position and returned fire. Then she gave the rifle to me. I'd never shot anything in my life, but I looked at those men destroying my city, and I learned. The factory fighting lasted for weeks. Every workshop became a fortress. Every machine became cover. The Germans brought up flamethrowers to burn out the defenders. The women fought from the assembly pits, the maintenance tunnels, the crane operator platforms high in the factory roof structure.
German soldiers were horrified to discover women among the defenders. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann, whose diary was recovered from his body after the battle, wrote, October 27th. Cleared another factory section today. Found 3 dead Russians at their position. 2 were women. One barely looked 20 years old. What kind of war is this, where we're shooting girls? The company commander says the Russians are animals who send their women to fight because they've run out of men. I think they're just defending their city any way they can. I'm not sure who the animals are. But Hoffmann's humane response wasn't universal. Many German units, especially SS formations, showed no mercy to captured women fighters. The records are fragmentary, often deliberately suppressed by Soviet authorities, who later tried to deny that untrained civilians had been thrown into combat. But the testimonies that survive tell of horrific treatment. Irina Bogacheva, captured while fighting at the Barikadi factory, and later escaping during a Soviet counterattack, testified to NKVD interrogators. They didn't treat us as prisoners of war. They called us partisans, terrorists. The SS officer who interrogated me said women who fought were criminals, not soldiers, and would be shot. He was very clear that we would be raped first, then executed. I was saved only because a Soviet attack overran the position where we were being held. This fear of capture drove many civilian women fighters to extremes. The practice of keeping the last bullet for yourself wasn't military doctrine. It was a survival calculation based on terrifying reality. Better a quick death than what the SS would do to captured women fighters. The nature of urban sniping in Stalingrad was nothing like the romanticized version portrayed in Soviet propaganda or later films. There were no heroic duels between equally matched marksmen. There was no honor. It was simply murder from concealment, repeated as often as opportunity presented itself. Kladia Kalugina, another non-soldier who became a killer in Stalingrad, explained the reality. People think sniping is about perfect shots at long range. In Stalingrad, most of my shots were from less than 50 meters. You found a hole in the rubble with good sight lines. You waited. When a German exposed himself, you shot him. Then you moved to a different position before they located you. I never made spectacular shots. I just shot people who made mistakes, then hid. The effectiveness of these improvised snipers came from their intimate knowledge of the ruins. They'd lived in these buildings before the war. They knew which walls were load-bearing, which basements connected to sewers,
Which rooftop access routes still existed? German soldiers were fighting in an alien landscape. The women were fighting in their destroyed homes. Soviet military records become confusing when discussing women fighters in Stalingrad, because official doctrine and brutal reality diverged completely. Officially, women in combat were volunteers who'd completed military training. Officially, civilians had been evacuated. Officially, the workers' militias were organized military units.
The reality was chaos. A workers' militia might consist of whoever happened to be in a factory when the Germans attacked. Training might mean watching someone work a rifle bolt once before being sent to a position. Military organization might mean a political officer pointing at a ruin and telling you to shoot Germans. The disconnect between official narrative and reality created problems for women survivors. After the war, many found their experiences disbelieved or deliberately suppressed. The Soviet state wanted heroic women warriors who'd volunteered to defend socialism. What they got were traumatized civilians who'd killed to avoid being killed. Vera Malakova, a physician who'd been pressed into combat at Stalingrad, wrote in her unpublished memoirs, "After the war, I tried to discuss what happened to us. The response was always the same. We must have misunderstood, or we were exaggerating, or we should be grateful for the opportunity to serve. Nobody wanted to hear that we'd been civilians thrown into combat without training. Nobody wanted to admit that many of us were threatened with execution if we didn't fight. The official story was so much better than the truth." As October 1942 turned into November, the battle for Stalingrad reached its crescendo. The Germans launched a massive offensive on October 14th to capture the factory district. It was the most savage day of the entire battle. The Allied Army Corps, supported by continuous airstrikes, threw everything at the Soviet defenders. In the Barikadi factory, a workers' detachment of 37 people, including 19 women, held a section of the factory floor against an entire German infantry company for 14 hours. When the position was finally overrun, only 5 people remained alive. 3 were women. The combat report, preserved in Soviet military archives, reads clinically, "In Barikadi factory, the workers' detachment fought in the factory during the day, and only after they exhausted their strength in the struggle with an enemy several times superior were they forced to withdraw to the eastern part of the factory. A total of 5 people remain from the NKVD company and the workers' detachment. Those 5 people, 3 of them women, untrained, unprepared. They'd held for 14 hours against professional Wehrmacht infantry supported by tanks and aircraft. They hadn't attended sniper school. They hadn't volunteered for glory. They just refused to die quietly." The famous defense of Pavlov's house has been celebrated in Soviet and Russian military history as an example of determined defense. What's less often discussed is that Pavlov's house was only one of dozens of similar positions throughout the city, many held partially or entirely by civilian women who never made it into the official record. Lieutenant Afanasy Pavlov gets credit for the defense. His name is on the building's memorial plaque. But interviews conducted decades later with survivors revealed that at various points during the 58-day defense, women made up nearly a third of the building's defenders. They weren't there officially. They were trapped civilians who'd picked up weapons from dead soldiers and joined the fight. One of these women,
Olga Kovalchuk, gave a rare interview in 1987. "We weren't supposed to be there. We weren't soldiers. But where else were we supposed to go? The building was surrounded. The only way out was across open ground under German fire. So we stayed, and we fought. The soldiers were professional about it. They showed us how to load magazines, how to throw grenades, where to position ourselves. They didn't care that we were women. They cared that we could shoot Germans." The German perspective on facing these civilian defenders reveals both respect and horror. Obergefreiter Benno Zieser, who survived Stalingrad and published his memoirs in the 1950s, described the psychological impact. "The worst part wasn't the professional soldiers. We could understand them. They were doing their duty like us. It was the civilians who terrified us. Women who would wait for hours in freezing ruins for a single shot. Old men who'd throw grenades from rubble piles. These weren't soldiers following orders. They were defending their homes with the desperation of people who had nothing left to lose. You can't negotiate with that. You can't demoralize that. You can only kill it, and it costs you everything in the process." The turning point came in November 1942, when Operation Uranus encircled the German Sixth Army. The German soldiers who'd been the hunters suddenly became the hunted. The civilian women who'd learned to shoot Germans during the city fighting now found themselves with besieged targets.
As the German pocket shrunk and starvation set in, German soldiers became increasingly desperate. They ventured into ruins, searching for food, fuel, anything to survive. The women in the ruins waited. Valentina Krutova, the 16-year-old who'd witnessed the city burning in August, had learned to shoot during the October factory fighting. By December, with the Germans trapped and dying, she had become something else entirely. By December, I'd killed 7 Germans, maybe more. I didn't always see if they died from my shots. I felt nothing about it anymore. They'd destroyed my city, killed my family, and now they were starving in the ruins of what they'd destroyed. I just shot them. Sometimes they'd beg, sometimes they'd cry. I didn't care. I'd learned not to care. This transformation from terrified civilian to cold-blooded killer happened to thousands of women trapped in Stalingrad. The psychological cost would haunt them for decades, but in the moment, it kept them alive. The final statistics of women's combat participation in Stalingrad are impossible to calculate accurately. Official Soviet records list 20,000 to 60,000 women as having participated in the battle in various capacities. But these numbers primarily count women who were officially mobilized, military nurses, communication personnel, properly enrolled soldiers. The women who picked up rifles from dead defenders, who shot Germans from ruins while claiming to be helpless civilians, who fought and killed and died without ever officially joining the military, they don't appear in the statistics. They were invisible in the official narrative, and many wanted to stay that way. After the German surrender on February 2, 1943, the survivors faced a new ordeal, explaining who they were and what they'd done. For women who'd fought without official status, this could be dangerous. The NKVD suspected anyone who'd survived German occupation of collaboration. Women who'd fought as irregulars were particularly suspect. Were they defenders or partisans? Had they followed orders or acted independently? Were they heroes or criminals? Many women simply never reported their combat service. Nadezhda Kolesnikova, the seamstress who'd killed 17 Germans from her ruined apartment building, returned to her profession after the war. She never applied for military recognition. She never sought veterans' benefits. When interviewed in 1968, she explained, "I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to remember it. I wasn't a soldier. I was a woman who'd been forced to become a killer to survive. That's not heroism. That's trauma. The government wanted heroes, but I was just trying to forget what I'd done and who I'd become." This reluctance to discuss their experiences created a historical blind spot. The trained women snipers, like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, became propaganda icons. The teenage girls of the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment eventually received recognition. But the housewives, factory workers, and students who'd picked up rifles and become killers out of pure necessity remained largely forgotten. The few comprehensive accounts that exist reveal the psychological cost. Claudia Loginova, one of the survivors of the 1077th Regiment, struggled with what she'd experienced. "I had nightmares for 20 years after the war. I'd see the face of the German tank commander I killed. I was 19 years old, 3 weeks out of high school. I'd never hurt anyone in my life. Then, in 2 days, I helped kill 83 tanks worth of men. How do you process that? How do you go back to being a normal person after that?" Many couldn't. Depression, anxiety, and what would now be recognized as PTSD plagued women veterans. But Soviet society in the 1940s and 1950s had little sympathy for psychological trauma. You'd defended the motherland. You should be proud. Anything else was weakness or insufficient ideological commitment. The women who'd fought as irregulars faced additional stigma. Post-war Soviet society expected women to return to traditional roles: wives, mothers, workers. Women who'd killed were uncomfortable reminders that the war had broken down social boundaries in ways the state preferred to forget. Vera Malakova noted the double standard. Male soldiers were heroes. They'd done their duty. Women soldiers were acceptable if they'd been nurses or communication personnel, traditional feminine support roles. But women who'd actually killed, society didn't know what to do with us. We were called unwomanly. Some men refused to marry women veterans, saying we were too hard, too damaged. We defended the motherland, but the motherland wanted us to go back to being soft and submissive afterward. Some women found themselves punished rather than praised. Claudia Kalugina, the civilian-turned-sniper who'd operated in the ruins, was questioned by the NKVD for 3 days after the battle. They wanted to know why I hadn't officially enlisted, why I'd fought as a civilian. They accused me of being a partisan, which legally was different from being a soldier. Partisans who'd operated without proper authority could be charged with banditry. I'd killed 13 Germans defending my city, and they threatened to charge me with operating as an illegal combatant. Eventually, they let me go, but the message was clear. We didn't fit their narrative. The narrative the Soviet state wanted was clean and heroic. Brave women volunteers, properly trained and ideologically motivated, defending socialism. The reality: desperate civilians handed weapons and threatened with execution if they didn't fight, didn't match the propaganda needs. As the decades passed, some women began to speak more openly. In the 1960s and 1970s, Soviet historians conducting local research in Stalingrad started collecting oral histories. These interviews, many never published during Soviet times, revealed the hidden story. Marina Chechneva, the literature student who'd learned to shoot in a basement, gave a lengthy interview in 1973.
"I had nightmares for 20 years after the war.
I'd see the face of the German tank commander I killed. I was 19 years old, 3 weeks out of high school. I had never hurt anyone in my life. Then in 2 days, I helped kill 83 tanks worth of men. How do you process that? How do you go back to being a normal person after that? Many couldn't. Depression, anxiety, and what would now be recognized as PTSD plagued women veterans. But Soviet society in the 1940s and 1950s had little sympathy for psychological trauma. You'd defended the motherland. You should be proud. Anything else was weakness or insufficient ideological commitment. The women who'd fought as irregulars faced additional stigma. Post-war Soviet society expected women to return to traditional roles: wives, mothers, workers. Women who'd killed were uncomfortable reminders that the war had broken down social boundaries in ways the state preferred to forget. Vera Malakova noted the double standard. Male soldiers were heroes. They'd done their duty. Women soldiers were acceptable if they'd been nurses or communication personnel, traditional feminine support roles. But women who had actually killed? Society didn't know what to do with us. We were called unwomanly. Some men refused to marry women veterans, saying we were too hard, too damaged. We'd defended the motherland, but the motherland wanted us to go back to being soft and submissive afterward. Some women found themselves punished rather than praised. Klavdia Kalugina, the civilian-turned-sniper who'd operated in the ruins, was questioned by the NKVD for 3 days after the battle. They wanted to know why I hadn't officially enlisted, why I'd fought as a civilian. They accused me of being a partisan, which legally was different from being a soldier. Partisans who'd operated without proper authority could be charged with banditry. I'd killed 13 Germans defending my city, and they threatened to charge me with operating as an illegal combatant. Eventually, they let me go, but the message was clear. We didn't fit their narrative. The narrative the Soviet state wanted was clean and heroic. Brave women volunteers, properly trained and ideologically motivated, defending socialism. The reality: desperate civilians handed weapons and threatened with execution if they didn't fight, didn't match the propaganda needs. As the decades passed, some women began to speak more openly. In the 1960s and 1970s, Soviet historians conducting local research in Stalingrad started collecting oral histories. These interviews, many never published during Soviet times, revealed the hidden story. Marina Chechneva, the literature student who'd learned to shoot in a basement, gave a lengthy interview in 1973. "I want people to know we weren't heroes. We were terrified. We killed people, yes, but not because we were brave. We killed because the alternative was being killed. Every shot I took, I was shaking. Every German I shot, I vomited afterward for the first dozen times. I became numb to it eventually, but that numbness was its own kind of death." The trained snipers, like Pavlichenko, they're heroes. They volunteered. They were prepared. They knew what they were doing. We were just civilians who learned to kill because we had no choice. That's not heroism. That's tragedy. The German perspective on these civilian fighters evolved over time as well. Immediate wartime reactions were often brutal. Women fighters were frequently executed as partisans. But surviving German veterans, looking back decades later, expressed a grudging respect mixed with horror. Wilhelm Hoffmann's diary, recovered from his frozen body in January 1943, concluded with entries that showed his understanding.
January 12th.
We're dying. The Russians are tightening the noose. Today I saw a woman in the ruins, maybe 30 years old, shooting at us from a collapsed building. She killed 3 men before we suppressed her position. When we reached her location, she was gone, vanished into the sewers. I don't hate her anymore. I understand her. We came to her city, destroyed it, killed her people. Now she's killing us, and I can't even call it wrong. This isn't war anymore. It's just murder and counter-murder, and everyone's guilty, and no one's guilty, and we're all going to die in these frozen ruins for nothing. The true accounting of civilian women who fought in Stalingrad may never be possible. The official numbers are unreliable. Many women never reported their combat service. Many died without their actions being recorded. The chaos of the battle meant that countless acts of defensive violence went undocumented. But estimates based on fragmentary records suggest that between 3,000 and 10,000 women fought in some capacity in Stalingrad who weren't officially enrolled in military units. Some fired a single shot in desperation. Others killed dozens over months of fighting. All of them were transformed by the experience. The weapons they used tell their own story. After the battle, Soviet forces recovering weapons from the ruins found Mosin Nagant rifles in the strangest places: basement hideouts, sewer junctions, collapsed buildings. Many showed signs of having been fired repeatedly by untrained users, barrels worn from improper cleaning, stocks repaired with scavenged materials. Each rifle was evidence of someone who'd fought and possibly died without ever officially being a soldier. One rifle, recovered from a collapsed apartment building in the Barikadi district, had 23 notches carved into the stock, the traditional sniper's kill tally. Forensic examination confirmed the rifle had fired approximately 90 rounds. The position suggested the shooter had remained in that location for weeks, firing from concealed positions at German troops in the street below. No body was found. The identity of the shooter remains unknown. But those 23 notches represent 23 German soldiers killed by someone who was never officially a sniper, never officially a soldier. The psychological impact on German soldiers of facing these civilian fighters cannot be overstated. Professional soldiers could rationalize fighting other soldiers, but killing women, especially women who are clearly not professional military personnel, created moral injury that haunted survivors.
Benno Zieser, in his post-war memoirs, described the cognitive dissonance. We'd been told we were fighting the Bolshevik army, liberating Russia from communist oppression. But in Stalingrad, we were fighting housewives and factory girls. These weren't soldiers spreading communism. They were people defending their homes. Every woman we shot raised questions we couldn't afford to ask. The worst was when we'd overrun a position and find that the Russian sniper who'd killed several of our men was a 17-year-old girl in a torn dress, still clutching a photograph of her family. What kind of liberation were we bringing that made teenagers shoot at us from ruins? This psychological dimension, the horror of industrialized warfare, turned against non-combatants, and the horror of non-combatants forced to become combatants, was something neither side wanted to address. The Germans couldn't admit they were losing to civilians. The Soviets couldn't admit they'd thrown civilians into combat without preparation. Both sides preferred narratives that featured professional soldiers fighting professional battles. The truth was far messier and far more tragic. As the Soviet Union collapsed and Russian archives opened in the 1990s, historians gained access to documents that had been suppressed for decades. NKVD reports, previously classified, revealed the extent to which civilians had been forced into combat roles. Political officers' reports candidly discussed the difficulties of maintaining discipline among non-military personnel engaged in combat operations, a bureaucratic euphemism for civilians handed rifles.
One particularly revealing document, dated October 17, 1942, from political officer Mikhail Vatutin to his superiors, outlined the problem. The workers' battalions consist primarily of civilians with no military training. Many are women. They have been issued weapons and ordered to defensive positions. Morale is problematic. These are not soldiers motivated by military discipline or ideological commitment. They fight because they have nowhere else to go and because NKVD blocking detachments prevent retreat. Effectiveness is surprisingly high given their lack of training. In defensive positions with clear fields of fire, they inflict significant casualties on German infantry. However, they cannot be used for offensive operations. They will hold positions but will not advance. Recommend regularizing their status or evacuating them, as current situation creates legal ambiguities regarding treatment if captured. The recommendation was ignored. The civilians stayed. They kept fighting. The most detailed accounting of civilian women's combat in Stalingrad comes from German military intelligence reports compiled during the battle. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence organization, conducted systematic debriefings of soldiers returning from Stalingrad. A classified report dated December 22, 1942, noted, "Enemy resistance in urban combat includes significant participation by civilian population, particularly women. Numerous engagements have been reported where defending forces included women in civilian clothing using military weapons. These combatants appeared to be local residents rather than regular military personnel." Interrogation of captured Russian officers indicates that civilian workers were organized into militia units with minimal training. Some women appeared to be operating independently as snipers in ruins. Recommend treating all military-age civilians in Stalingrad as combatants, as the distinction between civilian and military personnel has effectively ceased to exist. This recommendation, to treat all civilians as combatants, had horrific implications. It meant that German forces felt justified in shooting anyone they encountered in the ruins, regardless of whether they were armed. It also meant that the distinction between war crimes and legitimate military action became hopelessly blurred. The consequences played out in countless small tragedies throughout the battle. German patrols, burned by ambushes from apparent civilians, became trigger-happy. Civilians genuinely trying to survive without fighting were shot on sight. Women who had fought were executed if captured, often after torture and sexual violence. The gray zone between soldier and civilian became a killing ground where everyone was guilty and everyone was a victim. By January 1943, as the encircled German Sixth Army slowly starved and froze to death, the women in the ruins faced a different kind of warfare. The Germans, desperate for food and shelter, became increasingly aggressive in their search of ruins. The women, now experienced in the brutal calculus of urban combat, gave no quarter. Olga Kovalchuk, the woman who'd fought at Pavlov's house, described the final weeks. January was different from the earlier fighting. The Germans were dying on their feet. They'd stagger through the ruins looking for anything edible, anything burnable. Some would beg, some would try to surrender. The Soviet command had made it clear, no prisoners until the official surrender. So we shot them. I remember one German, maybe 20 years old, stumbled into our position. He was skeletal, could barely stand. He held up his hands and said, "Comrade," over and over. The soldier next to me raised his rifle. I put my hand on the barrel, pushed it down. The soldier looked at me and said, "Orders are orders." Then he shot the German anyway. I didn't feel bad for the German. I felt bad that I'd stopped feeling anything at all. That boy died in front of me, and I just stepped over his body to get to my firing position. The war had turned me into something I didn't recognize. The final days of the battle saw some of the most intense fighting. As the German pocket shrank, the density of combat increased. Every building, every basement, every pile of rubble became contested ground. The women who'd survived months of combat were hardened veterans now, more dangerous than the starving Germans they faced.
When Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943, Soviet forces began the grim task of cataloging the dead and identifying survivors. The counting revealed something that confused Soviet authorities. Hundreds of women found in defensive positions throughout the city. Many were dead at their posts, rifles beside them. Others were alive in cellars and ruins. When they asked for their unit assignments, they had none. They weren't soldiers. They were just there, civilians who'd fought. The political officers didn't know what to do with them. Give them medals? Court-martial them for fighting without authorization? Evacuate them as civilians? Nobody had anticipated this situation. Eventually, most were simply documented as civilian survivors and released. Their combat service went unrecorded. This administrative confusion meant that thousands of women who'd fought in Stalingrad disappeared from the historical record. They weren't counted among the military casualties. They weren't listed as combat veterans. They simply vanished into the category of civilian survivors, indistinguishable from those who'd hidden in cellars throughout the battle. Some women attempted to claim recognition. Anna Morozova, the tractor factory worker, applied for veteran status in 1946. Her application was rejected. The military commission ruled that since she'd never formally enlisted, never completed training, and never received orders from a military officer, her combat service didn't count. The fact that she'd killed 7 Germans defending the factory where she worked was irrelevant to the bureaucratic definition of military service. She appealed the decision. Her appeal was rejected. She tried again in 1953, after Stalin's death, hoping for a more sympathetic hearing. Rejected again. She gave up. In 1987, as Gorbachev's glasnost policies opened space for previously suppressed histories, Anna was interviewed by a local journalist. She was 69 years old, living alone in a small apartment in Volgograd, as Stalingrad had been renamed. The interview, published in a small regional newspaper, was one of the first public acknowledgments of civilian women's combat in the battle. "I don't need medals now. I'm too old for that. But I want people to know what happened. We weren't heroes. We were just ordinary women who were put in an impossible situation. We could fight or die, so we fought. The trained snipers, the real military women, they deserve all the recognition they get. But there were hundreds of us, maybe thousands, who fought without training, without uniforms, or even officially being soldiers. We killed Germans because that's what you had to do to survive. I'm not proud of it. I'm not ashamed of it. It's just what happened. But it should be remembered. All those women who died with rifles in their hands, who never appeared on any casualty list, who were buried in mass graves marked civilians, they were soldiers too, even if nobody ever admitted it."
The photograph accompanying the article showed an elderly woman with sad eyes, holding an old Mosin-Nagant rifle provided by the journalist as a prop. The caption read, "Anna Morozova, survivor of Stalingrad, holds a rifle similar to the one she used in 1942. The article generated controversy. Soviet military historians condemned it as sensationalism, claiming it exaggerated civilian participation. Veterans organizations split. Some supported Anna's account, others called it fabrication. The Ministry of Defense issued a statement reiterating that all combat in Stalingrad was conducted by properly organized military units. But the article also prompted other women to come forward. Throughout 1987 and 1988, regional newspapers in Volgograd published dozens of similar stories. A pattern emerged. Women who'd fought as civilians, received no recognition, struggled with trauma for decades, and were now, in their 60s and 70s, finally willing to discuss what they'd experienced. Valentina Krutova, now 63, gave an extensive interview to Izvestia. For 45 years, I told no one. My husband didn't know. My children didn't know. I was a 16-year-old girl who killed 7 men. How do you tell people that? How do you explain that you learned to shoot Germans the way other girls were learning to sew? The nightmares never stopped. I'd wake up screaming, seeing their faces. The first one I killed, I can still see him. He was checking a building, came around a corner, and I shot him from maybe 10 meters. He looked surprised more than anything. He fell, and I vomited. Then I reloaded. I'm telling this now because I'm old, and I want people to understand what war really is. It's not glory. It's not heroism. It's 16-year-old girls murdering strangers because there's no alternative. Every person who glorifies war should know what it turns ordinary people into. The flood of testimonies in the late 1980s prompted historians to reassess Stalingrad. Conventional narratives focused on military operations, great commanders, and strategic decisions. These women's stories revealed a parallel battle, the fight for survival by thousands of civilians who became soldiers by necessity rather than choice. The German archives, opened after reunification, provided corroboration. Wehrmacht combat reports consistently mentioned encountering female combatants in civilian clothing. After-action reports noted the difficulty of distinguishing civilians from combatants. Medical reports treated wounded German soldiers who'd been shot by female snipers in ruins.
One particularly detailed report from January 12, 1943, by Captain Werner Stellrecht of the 194th Infantry Regiment described an engagement. Patrol ambushed in factory district by fire from collapsed building. 3 men killed, 2 wounded before we suppressed the position. Upon investigation, found 1 enemy combatant dead, female, approximately 25 years old, wearing civilian clothing, torn dress, winter coat. Weapon was Mosin Nagant rifle with 27 remaining rounds. Position showed signs of extended occupation. Spent shell casings indicated at least 40 rounds fired from this location. No identification papers. This represents the 9th encounter with female combatants this week. They appear to be operating independently rather than in organized units. Recommend extreme caution when clearing ruins, as civilians must be considered hostile until proven otherwise. The phrase, "civilians must be considered hostile," captures the nightmare of Stalingrad's urban combat. The boundary between protected non-combatants and legitimate military targets had dissolved completely. Everyone was dangerous. Everyone was vulnerable. The normal rules of warfare meant nothing. By the time the Soviet archives opened fully in the 2000s, enough testimonies had accumulated that historians could no longer dismiss civilian combat participation as anomalous. Antony Beevor, in his authoritative history of Stalingrad, acknowledged that several thousand women fought in the city without formal military status. Russian historian Alexei Isayev, analyzing newly available documents, estimated that civilian combatants, both men and women, may have constituted as much as 15 to 20% of Soviet defensive strength during critical periods of the battle. This would mean 15,000 to 20,000 civilians with weapons, of whom women comprised approximately one-third. These numbers remain contested. Some historians argue they're too high, inflating civilian participation to create sensational narratives. Others argue they're too low, failing to account for the uncounted dead and those who never reported their service. What's undeniable is that thousands of women fought in Stalingrad who were never officially soldiers. They picked up rifles from dead defenders. They learned to kill by watching others. They died in basements and ruins without appearing on casualty lists. Their contribution to the Soviet victory was real and significant, even if officially unacknowledged. The psychological legacy of these women extended far beyond their own lives. Many who survived struggled with relationships, employment, and mental health. Post-war Soviet society offered no support for trauma. You were expected to move on, rebuild, contribute to reconstruction. Dwelling on wartime experiences was considered weak or politically suspect. Marina Chechnova, the literature student turned killer, never completed her degree. She worked as a factory laborer after the war, never married, and lived alone until her death in 1998. In her final interview before she died, she reflected, "The war destroyed my future as completely as it destroyed the city. I couldn't go back to studying literature after I'd killed people. How do you read poetry about love and beauty when you know what a human head looks like when a rifle bullet goes through it? How do you discuss the human condition when you've personally ended the human condition for multiple people? I tried to be normal. I tried to date, to socialize, to pretend I was just another young woman. But I'd wake up from nightmare screaming. I'd see a German on the street and instinctively look for cover. I couldn't form connections with people who hadn't experienced what I had. The war took 5 months of my life. Those 5 months took everything else." This pattern repeated across thousands of lives. Women who'd learned to kill in Stalingrad found themselves permanently changed. The line between victim and perpetrator had blurred beyond recognition. They'd been forced into violence, but they'd also become efficient at it. They'd suffered trauma, but they'd also inflicted it. This psychological complexity defied simple narratives of heroism or victimhood. Nadezhda Kolesnikova, the seamstress with 17 kills, developed severe depression in the 1950s. She attempted suicide twice. When asked by a psychiatrist about the source of her distress, she explained, "I'm not haunted by the men I killed. They were invaders destroying my city. What haunts me is how easy it became. The first one, I vomited for hours. The second one, I cried. By the fifth one, I felt nothing. By the 10th, I was coldly calculating the best shot placement for maximum effect. I'd become a machine for ending lives, and I did it efficiently. The war made me into a killer, and I accepted it. I became good at it. That's what horrifies me. Not that I killed, but that I got comfortable with it." What does that say about human nature? What does it say about me? The broader implications of civilian women's combat in Stalingrad challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, gender, and civilization. The Geneva Conventions assumed clear distinctions between soldiers and civilians, combatants and non-combatants. Stalingrad demonstrated that modern total war could obliterate these categories entirely. German legal theorist Carl Schmitt, writing after the war, used Stalingrad as an example of how modern warfare had evolved beyond traditional legal frameworks. When cities become battlefields and civilians become combatants, he argued the entire edifice of international law protecting non-combatants collapses. The women of Stalingrad, fighting in civilian clothes with captured weapons, existed in a legal and moral gray zone that neither side wanted to acknowledge. The Soviet state, for its part, preferred to minimize discussion of civilian combat participation. Official histories emphasize the role of properly organized military units, trained soldiers, and Communist Party leadership. Civilian fighters suggested chaos and improvisation, not the narrative of Soviet military competence the state wanted to project. This official reluctance to acknowledge civilian combat participation extended even to memorialization. The Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex, dedicated in 1967 as the centerpiece of Stalingrad remembrance, features heroic soldiers but no explicit recognition of civilian fighters. The massive Motherland Call statue depicts a woman but as an allegorical figure, not as the housewives and factory workers who actually fought.
It wasn't until 2013, 70 years after the battle, that a modest memorial to women defenders of Stalingrad was dedicated. Even this memorial primarily honors officially recognized military women, not the unacknowledged civilian fighters. The few surviving civilian fighters who attended the dedication ceremony were elderly, most in their 80s and 90s. Klavdia Lojanova, one of the last survivors of the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, gave a short speech. "We are finally being remembered, but many of us are already gone. The women who fought beside me, the women who picked up rifles in the ruins, the women who learned to kill to survive, most died without recognition. I'm standing here for all of them. The ones who died in the battle, the ones who died afterward, broken by what they experienced, the ones who lived but never spoke about what happened. We weren't heroes. We were just women trying to survive the worst battle in human history. But we did survive, and we did fight, and we did help win. That should be remembered." She died 6 months later, at age 91. Her obituary in Volgograd's newspaper noted her service in the 1077th Regiment, but didn't mention the 2 days in August 1942 when teenage girls in civilian clothes fought the 16th Panzer Division to a standstill. The complete story of civilian women's combat in Stalingrad will never be fully known. Too many died without leaving records. Too many survivors never spoke about their experiences. Too many stories were deliberately suppressed or officially denied. What remains are fragments. NKVD reports about civilians with weapons, German intelligence assessments of female combatants, scattered testimonies from survivors, rifle stocks with carved kill tallies found in ruins. These fragments tell a story that official histories tried to erase. The story of ordinary women forced to become extraordinary killers. The women who picked up rifles from fallen defenders weren't elite snipers. They weren't ideologically motivated volunteers. They weren't even soldiers in any formal sense. They were seamstresses and factory workers and students and mothers who found themselves trapped in hell with one simple choice: fight or die. They chose to fight. They learned to kill by doing it. They learned to shoot by shooting. They learned to survive by watching friends die. The training wasn't formal. It was observational, experiential, and brutal. Watch how this works. Now you try. Keep your head down. Aim for center mass. Don't think about them being human. Just shoot.
The weapons they used were crude by modern standards, bolt-action rifles designed in 1891. 5 rounds, manual operation, no optics. Effective range of 500 meters in trained hands, but most of their shooting happened at under 100 meters. Close enough to see faces, close enough to watch targets fall, close enough to know exactly what they'd done. The German soldiers who faced these women understood they were fighting something unprecedented. Not professional soldiers following doctrine, but desperate civilians defending their homes with the ferocity of animals protecting their dens. You couldn't demoralize them because they had nothing left to lose. You couldn't outmaneuver them because they knew every sewer, every basement, every crumbled wall. You couldn't frighten them because they were already living the worst nightmare imaginable. The mathematics of it were simple and terrible. Thousands of women, each with a rifle and ammunition. Millions of square meters of ruins providing concealment. Months of combat providing experience. The result was a distributed sniper network that the Germans could never eliminate. Suppress one position, another opened fire. Kill one sniper, another took her place. The civilian fighters were Hydra-headed, impossible to destroy because they weren't organized as a force that could be destroyed. By February 1943, when the battle ended, these women had collectively killed thousands of German soldiers. The exact number will never be known. Unlike trained military snipers who kept careful tallies, civilian fighters rarely recorded their kills. A notch on a rifle stock, maybe, a whispered confession to a friend. Usually nothing at all, just a memory they'd carry forever. The ultimate irony is that the women who were never soldiers may have been more effective than many who were. Professional soldiers followed doctrine, maintained organization, operated within command structures. The civilian fighters followed a simpler logic: survival. They took no unnecessary risks. They never exposed themselves for glory. They just waited, patient as death, and shot Germans when opportunity presented itself.
This effectiveness was born entirely of necessity. They didn't have the luxury of military tactics or the comfort of following orders. Every decision was personal. Take this shot or not. Move to a new position or stay. Risk checking on that wounded German or stay hidden. Wrong choices meant death. They learned fast because the alternative was dying stupid. The German military, despite its vaunted professionalism, had no effective counter to this form of warfare. Standard tactics for clearing buildings assumed defenders would be organized military units holding key positions. The civilian snipers didn't hold positions. They inhabited the entire ruins. They were everywhere and nowhere. You couldn't call in artillery on them because they were mixed among actual non-combatants. You couldn't assault them because there was no defined position to assault. You could only die to them, one soldier at a time, until you either left or killed every single person in the ruins. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound. They'd been trained to fight armies, not cities full of armed civilians. Every window could hide death. Every pile of rubble could conceal a sniper. Every civilian encounter was potentially fatal. This paranoia it generated destroyed unit cohesion and morale. Soldiers became trigger-happy, shooting at shadows and genuine civilians alike. This only increased civilian participation in combat. If you were going to be shot as a combatant anyway, you might as well actually fight. The Eastern Front developed a reputation among German soldiers as the worst posting in the Wehrmacht. Within that reputation, Stalingrad stood alone as the ultimate nightmare. Veterans of the city would later claim that combat in other sectors, even horrific battles like Kursk or the Rev meat grinder, were preferable to Stalingrad's urban hell. The difference was the civilians.
Other battles were army versus army. Stalingrad was army versus city, and the city fought back with the desperate fury of the damned. When German survivors returned from Soviet prison camps in the 1950s, many suffered from what would now be called PTSD, a common element in their nightmares: women's faces in rubble, rifles raised. The trauma of fighting civilians, particularly women, violated something fundamental in their psychological makeup. They'd been raised in a society that idealized protecting women. Instead, they'd been put in situations where killing women was necessary for survival. This cognitive dissonance shattered many soldiers' mental health permanently. Soviet propaganda never acknowledged this dimension of the battle's psychological warfare. The official narrative was heroic resistance by brave soldiers. The reality that much of the resistance came from traumatized civilians who'd been transformed into killers didn't fit the propaganda needs, so it was suppressed, minimized, and eventually forgotten by everyone except those who'd lived it. The women themselves rarely discussed what they'd experienced. It was too painful, too complex, too far outside normal human experience. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it's like to shoot a person at close range? How do you describe the sound a human body makes when a bullet passes through it? How do you convey the smell of a city full of corpses rotting in the summer heat, or the taste of fear that never quite goes away? You don't. You stay silent. You tried to forget. You failed to forget. You died decades later, taking your story with you. One of thousands of invisible participants in history's bloodiest battle. The modern visitor to Volgograd can tour the battle sites, now sanitized and memorialized. Pavlov's house stands restored, a monument to heroic defense. The grain elevator is preserved as a battlefield memorial. Mamayev Kurgan rises above the city, crowned by the massive Motherland Calls statue. It's all very impressive, very moving, very carefully curated to tell a specific story.
What's missing are the small plaques, the individual memorials, the acknowledgement of the thousands of women who fought without uniforms, without training, without recognition. There's no monument to the seamstress who killed 17 Germans from her apartment building. No memorial to the factory workers who learned to shoot while the battle raged around them. No recognition of the teenager who picked up a rifle from a dead soldier and discovered she could kill to survive. These women exist now only in fragments, scattered testimonies, German intelligence reports, unexplained notches on recovered rifle stocks. They're mentioned in footnotes, if they're mentioned at all. The grand narrative of Stalingrad, the story of military strategy and heroic resistance, has no space for the uncomfortable truth of civilian women forced to become killers. But their story is essential to understanding what Stalingrad really was. Not a conventional battle between armies, but a total war where the entire city became combatants, where the boundaries between soldier and civilian dissolved, where ordinary people discovered they were capable of extraordinary violence when given no alternative. The women snipers of Stalingrad who were never soldiers represent something that military history struggles to categorize. They weren't volunteers, they weren't trained, they weren't even officially combatants. They were just people who refused to die quietly, who picked up weapons and fought back, who learned to kill because the alternative was unacceptable. In that refusal, in that desperate fight for survival, they became something more than soldiers. They became living embodiments of the city's resistance, not because of training or ideology or military discipline, but because of something more fundamental, the human will to survive and the capacity for violence that emerges when that will is pushed to its absolute limit. The German soldiers who faced them understood this, even if they couldn't articulate it. They weren't fighting the Red Army in Stalingrad. They were fighting Stalingrad itself. Every brick, every basement, every pile of rubble, and every person still breathing in the ruins. The civilians with rifles were just one manifestation of that total resistance. The final accounting is impossible. How many women fought as civilian irregulars? Thousands, certainly. How many German soldiers did they kill? Thousands, probably. How many survived to tell their stories? Hundreds, maybe. How many were recognized for their service? Dozens at most. The rest disappeared into history's shadows, the unnamed, unacknowledged defenders who learned to kill without ever becoming soldiers. Their rifles were returned to armories. Their stories died with them. Their contribution to victory was absorbed into the general narrative of Soviet resistance, credit assigned to military units that often didn't exist or didn't operate in the sectors where civilian fighters held the line.
But the erasure also served the survivors' needs. Many didn't want to be remembered as killers. They wanted to move on, to forget, to return to being the people they'd been before the war destroyed their city and their innocence. Recognition would mean acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean reliving experiences they'd spent decades trying to suppress. Valentina Krutova, in her final interview before her death in 2008, explained this psychological dynamic. For 60 years, I told no one what I did. I was the woman who'd killed 7 Germans at age 16. But I was also a mother, a grandmother, a retired postal worker. I didn't want my grandchildren to know their babushka was a killer. I wanted them to remember me baking piroshki and telling fairy tales, not crouching in ruins with a rifle. But now I'm dying, and I realize the story needs to be told. Not for glory. I did nothing glorious. Not for recognition. I don't need medals. But because it happened. Because thousands of women like me fought and died without anyone knowing. Because the real cost of war isn't just the soldiers who die in uniform. It's the civilians who are forced to become soldiers, who are transformed into things they never wanted to be, who carry that transformation until they die. I killed those men, and I'm not sorry I did it, and I'm not proud I did it. It was just what happened when they destroyed my city. I want people to understand that. War doesn't make heroes. It makes survivors and corpses. I survived. Too many others didn't. She died 3 weeks after giving that interview. At age 83, her obituary didn't mention her wartime service. At her request, there was no military funeral. She was buried as she'd lived most of her life, as an ordinary civilian, unremarked and unremembered. But her testimony, and hundreds like it, preserved the truth that official histories tried to erase. The women snipers of Stalingrad, who were never soldiers, were real. They fought, they killed, they died. And they changed the course of history's bloodiest battle, one rifle shot at a time, from the ruins of a destroyed city. The mathematics of their contribution can never be precisely calculated. But consider this. If even 3,000 civilian women fought over the battle's 5-month duration, and each averaged just 1 confirmed kill per month,
That represents 15,000 German casualties, equivalent to an entire division destroyed by people who officially didn't exist. The German Sixth Army entered Stalingrad with approximately 250,000 men. By the time of surrender, only 91,000 remained alive. Of the 159,000 German casualties, how many fell to civilian fighters? The records don't specify. The German dead don't carry notation explaining whether they were killed by professional soldiers or civilians who'd picked up rifles from fallen defenders. But the German survivors knew. They'd faced these improvised fighters in the ruins. They'd watched comrades die to unseen snipers who vanished into rubble. They'd discovered positions where women in civilian clothes had held out for days or weeks against professional Wehrmacht infantry. They knew that Stalingrad was different from every other battle, not because of superior Soviet tactics or overwhelming military force, but because the city itself had become their enemy. The women who were never soldiers were just one element of that total resistance. But they represented something the Germans had never encountered before and weren't equipped to handle. Total civilian participation in warfare. Not organized partisans operating in forests, but housewives in ruins with rifles refusing to die quietly. This was Stalingrad's secret weapon. Not T-34 tanks or Katyusha rockets or strategic brilliance, but the desperate fury of people defending their homes with whatever tools came to hand. The women who picked up rifles from dead soldiers embodied that fury in its purest form. They weren't fighting for Stalin or communism or military glory. They were fighting because the alternative was death. And they decided that if they had to die, they'd take some of the invaders with them.
In that decision, repeated thousands of times across the ruins, ordinary women became extraordinary killers. Not through training or natural talent or ideological commitment, but through pure necessity married to human stubbornness. They learned to shoot by shooting. They learned to kill by killing. They learned to survive by watching others die and avoiding their mistakes. The legacy of these women extends far beyond Stalingrad. They demonstrated that modern urban warfare renders traditional distinctions between combatant and non-combatant meaningless. They proved that civilians can become effective fighters with minimal training if sufficiently motivated. They showed that military victory requires either the systematic elimination of all military-aid civilians or acceptance that every city block will be defended by people who have nothing left to lose. These lessons were learned in Stalingrad and forgotten repeatedly since. Every urban battle since, Hue, Grozny, Fallujah, Aleppo, has featured similar patterns of civilian resistance, improvised fighters, and the breakdown of clear battle lines. Military planners study these battles and conclude they need better tactics. They rarely acknowledge the fundamental truth: you cannot conquer a city whose people refuse to be conquered, and that refusal will manifest in thousands of small acts of violence by people who were never supposed to be soldiers. The women of Stalingrad who picked up rifles from fallen defenders represent the ultimate expression of that truth. They were seamstresses and factory workers and students and mothers. They became snipers and killers and defenders of their city, not because they chose to, but because history gave them no choice. Their story, mostly untold and largely forgotten, is the story of total war's human cost.
Not just the soldiers who die in uniform, but the civilians who are forced to become soldiers, who are transformed by violence, who spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile who they were with who they became. 70 million people died in World War II. Most of their stories will never be told. But the story of the women snipers who were never soldiers deserves telling, not because it's heroic, but because it's true, because it happened. Because thousands of women learned to kill in the ruins of Stalingrad, and most of them died without anyone knowing their names. And the few who survived carried that burden until their graves. They weren't soldiers. They were something else entirely. Ordinary people pushed beyond ordinary limits, who discovered that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary violence when survival demands it. That's not a comfortable truth. It doesn't fit in monuments or official histories or heroic narratives. But it's the truth nonetheless. And truth, however uncomfortable, is what history owes to those who lived it. The women who were never soldiers have mostly died now. The last survivors are in their 90s, memories fading, stories disappearing. Soon there will be no living witnesses to what happened in the ruins of Stalingrad. All that will remain are the fragments, scattered testimonies, German intelligence reports, notched rifle stocks in museums. And the lesson, if we choose to learn it, that in total war, everyone becomes a soldier. Not by choice, not by training, but by simple, brutal necessity. The women of Stalingrad learned that lesson in blood and fire. They paid the price in trauma and lives lost, but in innocence lost forever. Their story ends not with victory parades or medals, but with quiet deaths decades later. Former killers who became grandmothers, who baked bread and told fairy tales and never mentioned what they'd done in the ruins. Who woke from nightmares they never explained, who flinched at sudden noises, who carried the weight of 7 or 13 or 17 humans killed until the weight finally crushed them. This is what war does to ordinary people. This is the cost that doesn't appear in casualty statistics. This is the story history tried to forget. But the women who were never soldiers deserve to be remembered, not as heroes, not as victims, but as what they were. Ordinary people who learned to kill because the alternative was unacceptable, who fought and died and survived in a battle that had no place for ordinary people. They picked up rifles from fallen defenders. They learned to shoot by shooting. They became snipers without ever going to sniper school. They killed thousands of German soldiers without ever officially being soldiers themselves. And when the battle ended, most of them disappeared into history's shadows, unmarked, unremembered, officially non-existent. Just another cost of war that nobody wanted to count. This is their story, however incomplete, however uncomfortable, however far from the heroic narratives we prefer. This is what really happened in the ruins of Stalingrad when 500,000 civilians were trapped in hell and thousands of women discovered they could kill to survive. They were never soldiers, but they fought, and they won, and they carried the price of that victory until their deaths.
In a small apartment in Volgograd, February 2019, 97-year-old Klavdia Loginova sat in her wheelchair, looking out at the Volga River.
She was the last known survivor of the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, the teenage girls who'd held the 16th Panzer Division for 2 days in August 1942. A journalist from Moscow had come to interview her for the 76th anniversary of the battle's end. She'd given dozens of interviews over the years, always saying the same things about duty and courage and defending the motherland. The official story, the comfortable story. But this time, perhaps sensing it was her last chance, she told the truth. "You want to know what it was really like? I'll tell you. I was 19 years old, 3 weeks out of school. I'd volunteered for the anti-aircraft regiment because it sounded exciting and patriotic. I thought I'd shoot down German planes and be a hero. Instead, they gave us a gun designed to shoot at aircraft and told us to shoot at tanks. We had no training for it. No one showed us how. We just lowered the barrels and started firing. The first tank I hit, I watched the crew bail out, and then our gun next to us killed them as they ran. I remember thinking, this is murder. Then I reloaded and looked for another target. For 2 days, we murdered men in tanks. That's what it was. Not heroic combat. Murder. They were trying to kill us, yes. But we were teenage girls, shooting professional soldiers with weapons we barely knew how to use. And we were good at it. That's what still haunts me. We were good at it. After the war, I tried to be normal. I got married, had children, worked as a teacher. But I never forgot the faces of the men I killed. Some nights I still see them. Not nightmares anymore. I'm too old for that. Just memories. The tank commander who climbed out of his disabled tank and looked right at me before I shot him. I can still see his expression. Surprise, mainly. Like he couldn't believe a teenage girl in a summer dress was about to kill him. The state gave me medals. They called me a hero. They told my story in schools as an example of Soviet courage. But they never told the true story. That we were terrified children thrust into combat with no preparation. That most of us died. That those of us who survived were permanently damaged by what we'd seen and done. You want to know about the women who picked up rifles from dead soldiers? I'll tell you about them too. I saw it happen dozens of times during the battle. A soldier would fall, and a woman, sometimes a girl younger than me, would pick up his rifle and start shooting. No training, no orders, just pure survival instinct. I met one of them in a basement in October. Her name was, I forget now. I forget so much now. But she was maybe 25, maybe 30, a factory worker, I think. She'd picked up a rifle in September and had been shooting Germans from ruins for weeks. She had a system. Shoot once, move positions, wait hours, shoot again. She told me she'd killed 11 men. 11! And she was just a normal woman who'd worked a lathe before the war. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a hero. She was just someone who'd learned to kill because the alternative was death. Like all of us. We weren't special. We weren't brave. We were just people in an impossible situation who discovered we could kill to survive. That's the story that should be told, not the propaganda version. Not the heroic narrative. The truth, that war takes ordinary people and transforms them into killers, and that transformation is permanent. You don't go back, you just learn to hide what you've become. I've hidden it for 77 years, but I'm dying now, and I want one person to know the truth. We weren't heroes. We were survivors. And survival required becoming things we never wanted to be. She died 3 weeks later, on February 21st, 2019.
Her obituary called her the last hero of the 1077th Regiment. It mentioned her medals and her courage and her dedication to preserving the memory of the battle.
It didn't mention what she'd finally admitted in her last interview, that she'd spent 77 years haunted by the faces of the men she'd killed, that she'd never felt like a hero, that the war had damaged her in ways that never healed. The journalist filed the interview. It was published in a small online journal that most people never read. The truth, as always, reached fewer people than the comfortable lie. But it was preserved, and that matters. Because somewhere in Russia, or Germany, or America, someone might read Claudia's words and understand what war really is. Not glory and heroism, but ordinary people forced to become killers, forever changed by what necessity demanded of them. The women who were never soldiers are all dead now. The last witnesses are gone. Soon even the memory of them will fade, absorbed into generalized narratives about the Great Patriotic War and the defense of Stalingrad. But for a moment they were real, thousands of them, ordinary women in extraordinary circumstances, forced to pick up weapons, forced to kill, forced to become something they never imagined they could be. They fought without training, without recognition, without choice. They killed without counting, without celebrating, without forgetting. They survived without healing, without speaking, without being acknowledged. And they died, one by one over decades, taking their stories with them, stories of terror and trauma, of necessity and violence, of ordinary people discovering they were capable of extraordinary things when survival demanded it. This is their memorial, not in stone or bronze, but in words, not in a place, but in memory, not celebrating their violence, but acknowledging their humanity, the full, complicated, uncomfortable humanity of people who learned to kill and lived with that knowledge until their deaths. They were never soldiers, but they fought the bloodiest battle in human history. And they won. And they paid the price for that victory in ways that medals and monuments can never capture. Their names are mostly forgotten, their deeds largely unrecorded, their stories suppressed by both the state they defended and their own desire to forget. But they existed, they fought, they mattered. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, in the summer and fall and winter of 1942, thousands of ordinary women discovered that when you take away all other choices, ordinary people are capable of anything, even killing, especially killing. Because in the end, survival is the most powerful motivator in human existence. And in Stalingrad, survival required transformation, from civilian to killer, from innocent to veteran, from who they were to who they had to become. The women who picked up rifles from fallen defenders made that transformation. They paid the price, and they deserve to be remembered, not as propaganda figures or heroic symbols, but as what they were. Human beings, pushed beyond human limits, who discovered the terrible truth that those limits don't really exist. That when survival demands it, anyone can kill. That when home is being destroyed, anyone can fight. That when all alternatives are eliminated, anyone can become a soldier, even without ever officially being one. This is what Stalingrad taught the world in thousands of small lessons written in blood across the ruins. that total war makes everyone a combatant, that civilization is a thin veneer over the capacity for violence, that ordinary people, given no choice, will do extraordinary things, and that the cost of discovering this truth is carried forever by those who lived it.
The women who were never soldiers learned these lessons. They paid the tuition in trauma and lives and innocence lost. They graduated from the University of Ruins with degrees in survival and killing. And then they spent the rest of their lives trying to forget what they'd learned. Most succeeded in forgetting, at least publicly. They buried their experiences, locked away their memories, became the people they'd been before, or close enough that others couldn't tell the difference. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, they remembered. The face of the first German they killed, the weight of the rifle in their hands, the smell of cordite and death that permeated the ruins, the sound of their own breathing as they waited for a target, the moment of decision, shoot or don't shoot, the recoil against their shoulder, the sight of the target falling, the knowledge that they'd just ended a human life, and the terrible discovery that they could do it again, and again, and again, until it became routine, until they became efficient, until they stopped being the people they'd been and became the people the war needed them to be. That transformation from civilian to killer is the untold story of Stalingrad. It happened to thousands of women. It happened to tens of thousands of civilian men. It happened to children who picked up grenades and old men who manned machine guns and families who booby-trapped their own homes before fleeing. The entire city became a weapon. Every person became a potential combatant. The boundary between soldier and civilian dissolved completely, and in that dissolution, total war revealed its true nature. There are no innocents in total war. There are only survivors and casualties, and the line between them is determined by willingness to kill. The women snipers of Stalingrad, who were never soldiers, they existed. They fought. They killed. They survived. And they carried the weight of what they'd done until death released them.
Their story ends here, in these words, preserved against the forgetting that has already claimed most of their names and all of their faces. They were ordinary women in extraordinary circumstances. They became extraordinary killers out of ordinary necessity. And they paid an extraordinary price for ordinary survival. Remember them, not as heroes, not as symbols, but as human beings who learned the hardest lesson, that anyone can kill, that everyone has a breaking point beyond which survival demands violence, that transformation, once begun, can never be undone. The women who were never soldiers proved this truth in the ruins of Stalingrad, and the truth, uncomfortable as it is, deserves to be told. This is that truth. This is their memorial. This is what remains when the propaganda fades and the monuments crumble and the last witness dies. The uncomfortable, undeniable, unforgettable truth of what ordinary people become when war demands it. They become killers, and they live with that truth forever. The women who were never soldiers lived it. Now you know it too.